Hi, my name is Claire. I know Katie from school. We were both at Stanford and we were both in Chi Omega, and I asked her to adopt me as her little.
When my little
Um,
deactivated and her big sister deactivated, and it was a match made in heaven, and we've been friends ever since.
exactly, which was a wild time, and I think our sort of similar macabre sensibilities help there a little bit.
Absolutely. And it turns out we have an incredible amount in common, and one of those things that we have in common is our love of certain kinds of literature. So I thought you should take it away.
Alrighty, so the Gothic, a super fun genre that I think is massively understood by people who don't read a lot of it. Um, so one of the seminal works of the Gothic is this book called The Castle of Otranto, which was written in 1764 by Horace Walpole. It's sort of what most scholars count as like the archetypal Gothic book. Personally, when I first read it, I was like, there's a lot borrowed from Hamlet here, so let's think about that. So I personally count Hamlet as kind of a proto-Gothic
Yeah.
text. So some of the big names that count as Gothic, in addition to the Castle of Otranto, are Frankenstein, Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, and Radcliffe's The Italian. Some more modern titles, including Phantom of the Opera, The Haunting of Hill House. So, to quote Neil Gaiman, who is not objectively a Gothic author, but I think was deeply influenced by the Gothic, fantasy, and in my case, Gothic, is fundamentally metaphor made literal. So the entire genre is basically like social critique and concepts turned into very physical representations of those ideas. So we get tropes that literalize that, like doubles, the undead, so ghosts, vampires, in the case of Frankenstein, the creature, all representing things like generational sin, the sort of blurring of the self and the other, more medieval modes of thought versus the Enlightenment, emotionality versus like repressed intellectualism. Um, and in the words of Carmen Maria Machado, who's a Gothic author writing right now, she wrote a short story collection called Her Body and Other Parties. She talks specifically about how the Gothic has a lot of power to make the voiceless irresistibly heard. So it's about a lot of circularity, and that's one reason why I like it so much. Is it gives its characters nowhere to hide, basically, and is very into the idea of psychological unearthing and examination.
And I think that's
Um,
also why you end up with so many Gothic artists and writers who are women or other marginalized communities,
oh,
because
exactly, yeah.
it gives them a literal way to give their voices and opinions through a narrative that comes across. It doesn't hit you over the head, right? It is these like subtle manifestations through metaphor and through different plot devices that like when you read Frankenstein for the first time, you don't think about all of the layers of meaning behind it until maybe a teacher unpacks it for you, for example.
Well, and Frankenstein's super interesting, especially when you think about it in the context of Shelley's life in terms of the irresponsibility of intellectual creation and her relationship with her father and all that. So there's a lot there. um, but in terms of like psychological unearthing and all that, unfortunately, we do have to talk about Freud, who, we all hate. However, in the case of the Gothic, does actually have a point. So a lot of Gothic fiction or Gothic literary criticism at least stems from Freud's concept of the uncanny, or, excuse me, any German speakers, like he calls it the Unheimlich, I believe, which is basically the idea of that which ought to have remained secret and hidden but has come to light. So he sort of talks about this more as like child trauma
Right.
manifesting as an adult and things like that, but that does serve as a very good scaffolding for reading a lot of Gothic fiction. It really encompasses the obsession with time, with circularity, with the visitation of the sins of the father on the son, and being sort of unable to escape history and your own past. Um, where am I going with this? Yeah,
Everywhere.
so exactly, yeah. So there's Freud, and that's kind of the platform we're going to use to talk about things. a really good example that we have both read is Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, which I only read this summer actually, and I feel a little bit bad about having made it this far in my life without having read it.
Did you at least read
Um,
it before watching the Netflix series?
no, I saw the show first. I'm a
Wow!
terrible person. I know.
Who are you?
Although to be fair, I think the TV show is a masterpiece and did very, very well expanding on the source material, but keeping within the themes explored. So that's going to come a little bit later. But so the edition I read had an introduction by Guillermo del Toro, which was great, and I loved reading uh, because it talked a lot about how in conversation Hill House is with previous texts, especially stuff like The Turn of the Screw, which is the book that the new Haunting of Hill House season, The Haunting of Bly Manor, was based on. Much more loosely than The Haunting of Hill House, but still was based on. So that was really cool to think about in terms of female authors, as we said earlier, sort of taking a lot of a previously male-dominated genre and turning it into something that really indicates or expresses a kind of widespread female experience.
Right.
What did you think the first time you read Haunting of Hill House?
So I read it for the first time when I was a freshman in college, and that was the same time I was reading Lovecraft for the first time. I was just kind of in a
Ooh,
huge
yeah.
spooky mood, and as like, you
Speaking
know,
of Guillermo del Toro influences, yeah.
exactly. And I've always just been in love with horror and creepy things and like Scooby-Doo and Goosebumps as a kid. So for me, it was just, I was looking for something on that level that just, you know, matched the creepy weather outside or whatever. But then when I was getting into it, I was like, oh my goodness, this isn't in the same way that, you know, you watch horror and come across a psychological thriller and you're like, wow, this is still creepy, but it's something totally different. The book kind of did that for me. I was like, wow, I got into this because it's known as this kind of creepy book. And then you think about it more deeply and you're like, wow, this has to do a lot with femininity and psychological trauma and wrapping those things into a story that has a lot of loose ends and a lot of multiple interpretations. And I loved it. And I read a lot of Shirley Jackson's other stuff and then became more familiar with her work this year when I read an article on Bitch Magazine's like website that was about her and queerness, and that was really interesting to me.
Nice, yeah.
So that's my
I might
spiel.
ask you for that article at the end of this because I have some other articles to recommend as well, so we can
Great.
exchange. Um, but also, let's talk about while we're talking about The Haunting of Hill House. The first paragraph, which is like extremely iconic and has been talked about a lot recently, because I think this was like the 50-year publication or something. There was an anniversary recently, and everyone was like writing retrospectives. But it really encapsulates a lot of concepts of the Gothic, which is why I wanted to read it. So the book starts with, no live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sun, stood by itself the hills, holding darkness within. It stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone.
Which is also
So
how the TV show opens.
exactly, and then they change it very slightly at the very end, not to spoil anyone who hasn't read it, but I mean, if you're watching that gets spoiled, I'm sorry, it's the nature of analysis. I will try and warn people when spoilers are coming. So she talks here about reality versus dreaming. She talks about shut doors. She talks about history and a place where reality is slightly off, which is very like something is rotten in the state of Denmark, to do a little Hamlet callback there. The idea of a place that has something historically wrong with it that is physically manifesting. So we get talk about doors that were sensibly shut and which all get both opened and shut against the character's will during the whole book.
And I think
Speaking of,
that's a
yeah,
good place to end this conversation. We need to shut our door and continue this
we're
later.
moving
We're
on.
out of time.
Oh God, okay.
So thank you for everything, and it's really great to see you and talk to you.
You too. We need to talk more. I miss hearing your voice.
Oh, ditto.